In the autumn of 1852, Sheriff Thomas Whitmore received a report that would haunt him until his dying day, deep in the hollows of Kentucky's Appalachian wilderness, where civilization barely touched the lives of those who dwelled there. An isolated farmstead held secrets too terrible for decent folk to comprehend. The Blackwood family had lived apart from society for 3 generations, their bloodline twisted by choices that defied both nature and God's law. What investigators discovered in that remote cabin challenged every notion of human decency and parental love. The evidence spoke of desperation so complete, madness so profound, that parents had committed an act against their own flesh that history would struggle to record. The child born of forbidden union had met an end that shocked even hardened lawmen. But what drove these parents to such unspeakable horror? Before we delve into this dark chapter of American history, tell us where you're watching from. And if this tale grips you, subscribe, because tomorrow brings an even more chilling revelation. Sheriff Thomas Whitmore had witnessed the brutal aftermath of Shiloh, where men's bodies lay twisted in unnatural positions beneath Tennessee's scorching sun. He had seen what cannon fire could do to human flesh, watched boys barely old enough to shave bleed out in muddy trenches, calling for their mothers. Yet nothing in his war experience prepared him for what awaited in the Kentucky hollows that October morning. The anonymous letter had arrived 3 days prior, written in shaky handwriting on paper that looked like it had been torn from a child's primer. "Something terrible at the old Blackwood place," it read. "Ain't seen smoke from their chimney in weeks." Children's cries stopped sudden-like. No signature, no return address, just the desperate plea of someone who lacked the courage to investigate themselves. Whitmore folded the letter and tucked it into his vest pocket, where it seemed to burn against his ribs like a brand. Deputy Marshal Samuel Hayes rode beside him, his young face pale with the anticipation of whatever horrors they might discover. Hayes had joined the force only 6 months ago, eager to bring law and order to Kentucky's wild territories. His enthusiasm reminded Whitmore of his own younger self, before war and violence had worn away his faith in human decency. The hand-drawn map accompanying the letter proved accurate despite its crude execution. They followed deer paths and dry creek beds deeper into the wilderness, where oak and maple trees created a canopy so thick that noon resembled twilight. The isolation struck Whitmore as deliberate, chosen by people who wanted no part of civilization's watchful eye. "How far back do you reckon they live?" Hayes asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the forest itself might overhear. "Far enough that screaming wouldn't carry." Whitmore replied, then immediately regretted the ominous observation when Hayes's face grew even paler. The Blackwood hollow opened before them like a wound in the earth. A narrow valley carved by some ancient stream, its sides steep enough to block the autumn sun. At its heart sat a cabin that might have been standing since Kentucky's earliest settlement day. Logs weathered gray as bone, chinked with mud and moss that had seen too many harsh winters. A stone chimney leaned at a precarious angle, and the roof sagged under the weight of neglect. No smoke rose from that crooked chimney. No sounds of human habitation broke the unnatural silence. Even the birds seemed to avoid this place, leaving only the whisper of wind through dying leaves to mark their presence. Whitmore dismounted and drew his Colt revolver, more from instinct than any immediate threat. Hayes followed suit, though his hands trembled as he checked his weapon. They approached the cabin with the careful steps of men who had learned that death often waited in quiet places. The front door hung askew on leather hinges, revealing darkness beyond that seemed to swallow light. Whitmore called out in his official voice, identifying himself as law enforcement, demanding response from any occupants. His words echoed off the valley walls and died without answer. The smell hit them first, not the clean scent of wood smoke or cooking food that should emanate from any proper home, but something else entirely. Something sweet and rotten that made Hayes gag and pull his neckerchief over his nose and mouth. "Dear God," Hayes whispered, "what is that stench?" Whitmore had smelled it before. in field hospitals where gangrene had taken hold, in shallow graves disturbed by wild animals. The unmistakable odor of death, left too long in warm places. They circled the cabin, noting details that painted a picture of gradual abandon. A vegetable garden choked with weeds, its harvest long rotted on the vine. Chickens dead in their coop, their bones picked clean by scavengers. A well with its rope frayed and bucket nowhere to be seen. But it was the scratches on the cabin's exterior walls that made Whitmore's blood run cold. Long gouges in the weathered wood, too deliberate to be accidental, too desperate to be decorative. As if someone inside had clawed at the walls, trying to escape something worse than whatever waited outside. "Sheriff," Hayes called from near the cabin's single window. His voice carried a note of discovery mixed with dread. "You need to see this." Whitmore joined his deputy at the window, where gaps in the makeshift shutters allowed glimpses into the cabin's interior. What little light penetrated the gloom revealed chaos. Overturned furniture, scattered belongings, dark stains on the wooden floor that looked suspiciously like dried blood. And there, partially hidden beneath a torn quilt, the unmistakable shape of human remains. The leather-bound Bible lay open on the cabin's rough-hewn table, its pages yellowed with age and stained with substances Whitmore preferred not to identify. The family record, written in fading ink across several generations, told a story that challenged both law and nature. Ezra Blackwood, the family patriarch, had arrived in Kentucky Territory in 1794 with his wife Temperance and their 2 young children. The careful script of his early entries spoke of hope and religious devotion. "The Lord has blessed us with fertile land far from the corruptions of civilized society," read one passage, dated 1795. "Here we shall raise our children in righteousness, away from the temptations that plague those who live too close to their neighbors." But as Whitmore traced his finger down the pages, the entries grew darker, more erratic. Temperance died in childbirth in 1798, leaving Ezra alone with 4 children in the wilderness. The births and deaths recorded afterward painted a picture of increasing isolation and questionable union. "Married my eldest son Josiah to the widow Morrison's daughter," read an entry from 18. Below it in different ink, "The widow has asked too many questions, better to keep to our own blood." That final sentence had been scratched out, but remained legible beneath the hasty marks. Deputy Hayes stood over Whitmore's shoulder, reading the disturbing chronicle with growing unease. The family tree that emerged from these pages resembled less a spreading oak than a twisted vine, folding back upon itself in ways that violated both custom and divine law. "Look at this," Hayes pointed to an entry from 1820. "Ezra married his own daughter Ruth to her half-brother Jeremiah. Says here it was to keep the bloodline pure and away from outside corruption." Whitmore continued reading, his jaw tightening with each revelation. The isolation had bred more than just physical abnormalities. The religious justifications grew more elaborate and disturbing as the years passed. Andrew had convinced himself that his family was chosen, that their separation from society was divinely ordained, that the usual rules governing human relationships did not apply to God's elect. By 1825, the entries showed clear signs of mental deterioration. Ezra wrote of visions of angels who spoke to him in dreams, commanding him to preserve his family's special destiny through any means necessary. The handwriting became erratic, sometimes switching to crude drawings of biblical scenes that bore little resemblance to any scripture. Whitmore recognized, "The seed of the righteous shall not be mixed with the corruption of strangers." Hayes read aloud from a particularly disturbing passage. "As Abraham took his own kin to wife, so shall we preserve the holy bloodline from contamination." The biblical justifications grew more twisted with each generation. What had begun as religious isolation had devolved into something that would have horrified any legitimate minister. Yet the family had continued, each generation more damaged than the last, more convinced of their special status, more willing to cross boundaries that should never be crossed. Whitmore found the final entries, written in a different hand, feminine, but shaky with either illness or madness. Susanna Blackwood was signed at the bottom, along with the date, March 1851. Papa Ezra passed to glory last winter, the entry read. Brother Jeremiah and I are alone now with only each other for comfort and companionship. The outside world grows more wicked each day. We hear tell of wars and rumors of wars. Just as Scripture foretold, better to cleave unto each other than risk contamination from strangers who know not the Lord's special plan for our family. The next entry, dated 6 months later, made both men's blood run cold. Jeremiah and I have taken vows before God. What the world calls sin, heaven calls necessity. We shall raise up children unto the Lord, pure and undefiled by outside blood. Hayes set down the Bible with trembling hands. Sweet Jesus! They actually believed this madness justified what they did. Whitmore closed the book carefully, as if its contents might somehow escape and contaminate them both. The family Bible, which should have been a record of faith and righteousness, instead chronicled 3 generations of moral decay disguised as religious devotion. Around the cabin, other evidence supported the Bible's terrible chronicle. Daguerreotype photographs showed the progression of genetic damage across generations. The early pictures revealed normal-looking pioneers, but later images showed the telltale signs of inbreeding. Asymmetrical features, unusually large or small heads, eyes that looked in different directions, children's toys carved from wood, suggested that offspring had been born to these unions, but their current whereabouts remained a mystery that filled Whitmore with dread. If the family had been willing to justify incest through twisted scripture, what other horrors might they have convinced themselves were divinely sanctioned? The isolation that had begun as religious devotion had become a breeding ground for madness that would shock even the most hardened observers of human depravity. The torn fabric, caught on a splinter of wood near the cabin's back door, fluttering in the October breeze like a tattered prayer flag. Whitmore approached it with the careful steps of a man who had learned that small details often revealed the largest horrors. The cloth was once white, perhaps part of a child's nightgown or undergarment. Now it bore stains that spoke of violence, dark brown patches that could only be dried blood, and other discolorations that suggested the fabric had been present during something unspeakable. Hayes knelt beside the fragment, his face pale as autumn frost. Size suggests a young child, maybe 6 or 7 years old. Whitmore nodded grimly and used his knife tip to carefully lift the fabric from its wooden snag. The material tore easily, weakened by exposure and whatever trauma had originally damaged it. As he examined it more closely, he noticed what appeared to be bite marks along one edge, small, desperate tears that painted a picture of a child trying to silence their own screams. "There's more," Hayes called from the cabin's interior, his voice thick with revulsion. Inside the one-room dwelling, the true scope of the horror began to reveal itself. What they had initially mistaken for general disorder was actually the aftermath of a violent struggle. Furniture lay overturned, not from neglect, but from desperate flight. Scratch marks on the wooden walls showed where small fingers had clawed for purchase, trying to escape something that should have protected rather than pursued. But it was the discovery near the cold fireplace that stopped both men in their tracks. Partially hidden beneath a pile of moldering blankets, they found what remained of a child. The bones, picked clean by scavengers that had somehow gained entry to the cabin, told a story more horrible than any war battlefield Whitmore had witnessed. The skull showed clear signs of trauma, a crushing blow that would have ended life instantly. But it was the condition of the other bones that made Hayes rush outside to empty his stomach against the cabin wall. Score marks on the ribs and leg bones, made by human teeth, provided evidence of an act so depraved that both men struggled to accept what their eyes confirmed. "Dear God in heaven," Whitmore whispered, his voice barely audible in the cabin's oppressive silence. "They actually did it. They consumed their own child." The positioning of the remains suggested the act had not been committed in a moment of madness, but with deliberate planning. A crude butcher's table near the fireplace bore similar stains to those on the child's clothing. Primitive cutting tools lay scattered nearby, their edges dulled by use that no civilized person should contemplate. Whitmore forced himself to examine every detail, knowing that understanding the full scope of this crime was essential for justice. The child had been small, malnourished, suggesting a life of privation even before its horrific end. Genetic abnormalities, evident in the bone structure, confirmed what the family Bible had already revealed. This was the product of the forbidden union between Susanna and Jeremiah Blackwood. Hayes returned to the cabin, his face green but determined to do his duty. "Sheriff, what manner of desperation drives parents to such an act?" "The kind that comes from complete isolation," Whitmore replied, though his own voice carried doubt. "When people cut themselves off from all human contact, from all moral guidance except their own twisted interpretations, they can convince themselves that any act serves survival." Yet even as he spoke these words, Whitmore struggled to comprehend how starvation alone could lead to such depravity. He had known families who survived brutal winters on tree bark and boiled leather, who watched children waste away from hunger, but none who had crossed this ultimate boundary of human behavior. The evidence suggested planning, deliberation, perhaps even ritualistic elements that elevated this beyond mere survival cannibalism. Symbols scratched into the cabin walls bore resemblance to the twisted religious imagery they had found in Ezra Blackwood's Bible. This was not just murder, born of desperation, but some perverted sacrament performed by minds completely severed from moral reality. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the hollow, both men understood they faced a case unlike any in American legal history. The torn child's clothing in Whitmore's pocket seemed to weigh more than lead, physical evidence of innocence destroyed by the very people charged with its protection. But questions remained that would haunt their investigation. Where were Susanna and Jeremiah Blackwood? Had they fled after committing this ultimate transgression, or did the cabin hold more secrets yet to be uncovered? The leather-bound journal lay hidden beneath loose floorboards near the cabin's single window, discovered only when Hayes noticed the uneven planking. Susanna Blackwood's diary, written in a delicate hand that gradually deteriorated over its pages, provided a window into a mind's slow descent into madness. The early entries, dating back to 1850, revealed a woman clinging to fragments of normalcy despite her horrific circumstances. "Jeremiah brought me wildflowers today," read one passage. "Purple violets from the meadow where we played as children. Sometimes I can almost forget the strangeness of our situation when he shows such gentle kindness." But as Whitmore read deeper, the entries revealed the psychological warfare that isolation and guilt had waged upon Susanna's sanity. The woman who had once written lovingly of spring flowers gradually transformed into someone who viewed the outside world as a hostile force bent on destroying her family's sacred mission. "The preacher man came asking questions again," she wrote in July, "standing at the edge of our property like he had some right to judge what goes on between a man and his wife. Jeremiah sent him away with hard words, but I see the doubt creeping into his eyes. Even God's chosen must endure trials of faith." The religious delusions that had infected 3 generations of Blackwoods manifested differently in Susanna's feminine perspective. Where her grandfather Ezra had seen himself as a patriarch chosen by divine will, Susanna cast herself as a suffering Madonna, enduring persecution for the sake of a higher purpose that common minds could not comprehend. "They whisper about us in town," another entry revealed. "Call us unnatural, sinful, cursed. But they understand nothing of sacrifice, nothing of the pure love that exists between souls who have known each other since birth. Jeremiah and I share a bond that transcends their petty moral boundaries." Hayes looked up from his own examination of the cabin's corners. "Sheriff, look at this." He held up what appeared to be children's toys, wooden dolls carved with obvious care, but disturbing features. The faces showed the same asymmetrical characteristics evident in the family photographs, suggesting that even the children's playthings reflected their genetic abnormalities. Whitmore continued reading, watching Susanna's handwriting grow more erratic as her mental state deteriorated. The announcement of her pregnancy filled several pages with religious rapture, mixed with very human terror. "God has blessed our union with new life," she wrote in September 1851. "I feel the child growing within me, proof that heaven smiles upon what earthly men condemn. Yet I confess to moments of doubt, times when I wonder if we have somehow strayed from righteousness into territory that even the Lord's mercy cannot bless. The pregnancy entries revealed a woman torn between maternal joy and growing horror at what she and Jeremiah had created. As the month passed, her descriptions of the developing child took on increasingly ominous tones. "The child moves strangely within me," she wrote in her 7th month. Not the gentle flutter that other women describe, but violent thrashing, as if it seeks to escape the very womb that nurtured it. "Sometimes I wake to find bruises where it has kicked, purple marks that fade by morning but leave me wondering what manner of creature we have brought into being." The birth itself, described in shaking handwriting, revealed the full horror of the genetic legacy 3 generations of inbreeding had produced. The child, unnamed in Susanna's writings, suffered from severe deformities that made normal life impossible. "It cannot hold its head upright," she wrote with the clinical detachment of someone forced to confront an unbearable reality. "The eyes point in different directions, never focusing on the same object. When it cries, which is constant, the sound resembles nothing human." Jeremiah refuses to look upon it, claims it is punishment for some sin he cannot name. But perhaps most disturbing were the final entries, where Susanna's maternal instincts warred with growing revulsion toward her own offspring. The woman who had justified incest through religious conviction found herself unable to love the child that resulted from their union. "I try to nurse it, but my body rebels," she confessed in handwriting so shaky it was barely legible. "The child's touch burns like fire, and its cries pierce my soul like daggers. Sometimes I find myself staring at it for hours, wondering if this twisted creature is punishment for our presumption in thinking ourselves above God's natural laws." The diary's pages grew shorter, more fragmented, as if Susanna's ability to form coherent thoughts was deteriorating along with her circumstances. References to hunger became more frequent, descriptions of the child's suffering more detailed and desperate. The final entries spoke of conversations between Susanna and Jeremiah about ending the creature's suffering, discussions that gradually evolved from mercy killing to something far more sinister as starvation and madness consumed their last vestiges of humanity. The crude wedding ring lay half buried in the cabin's dirt floor, fashioned from melted coins and hammered into a rough circle by unskilled hands. Its surface bore scratches that might have been attempts at decoration, or perhaps the desperate marks of fingers trying to remove what could never be undone. Whitmore held the primitive band up to the dim light filtering through the cabin's single window. Silver coins, probably Spanish pieces, that had somehow found their way to this remote hollow, had been melted down and reformed into this symbol of an unholy union. The craftsmanship was crude but deliberate, speaking of siblings who had convinced themselves that creating their own wedding ritual would somehow sanctify what nature and civilization condemned. The story of Jeremiah and Susanna's descent into forbidden love emerged from scattered evidence throughout the cabin. Letters between them, hidden in a wooden box beneath their shared bed, revealed the gradual erosion of natural boundaries that should have protected them from their own worst impulses. The earliest correspondence, dated shortly after their parents' deaths in 1849, showed nothing more than siblings offering each other comfort in grief. "Dear sister," Jeremiah had written, "the isolation grows heavy upon my spirit. Some days I wonder if we are the last souls left in all creation, so complete is our separation from fellowship with other Christians, but isolation breeds its own particular madness." As months passed with no human contact beyond each other, the letters revealed a dangerous intimacy developing between brother and sister. Shared memories of childhood became idealized, their bond elevated to something mystical and predestined. "We understand each other as no husband and wife ever could," Susanna had written in response to one of Jeremiah's increasingly romantic overtures. Born of the same womb, raised by the same hands, we share a connection that transcends the crude partnerships formed by strangers who meet in adulthood. Hayes discovered additional evidence of their twisted courtship in the form of pressed flowers and love tokens, tokens exchanged by proper suitors. But these romantic gestures, innocent in themselves, took on sinister meaning when passed between siblings who had convinced themselves that their shared blood made them more suited for marriage than less suitable. The religious justifications for their union filled several pages of correspondence, revealing minds desperate to find scriptural support for their unnatural desire. They quoted selectively from Genesis, focusing on passages about the early patriarchs while ignoring the broader context of divine law. Abraham took Sarah to wife, though she was his half-sister. Jeremiah had written with the fervor of a man grasping for salvation through semantics. If the father of nations could marry his own blood, how can lesser men condemn what worked righteousness in God's sight? Their wedding ceremony, described in Susanna's diary, took place in the cabin during the winter. With no minister willing to perform such a service, they had created their own ritual, combining fragments of scripture with personal vows that would have horrified any legitimate clergyman. "We stood before God with no witness save the angels," Susanna had recorded. "Jeremiah placed the ring he had made upon my finger, and I placed its twin upon his. We spoke the words that bound us not just as husband and wife, but as keepers of our family's sacred bloodline." The physical evidence of their union disturbed Whitmore even more than their written justifications. The cabin's single bed, obviously built for two people, bore stains and markings that spoke of a sexual relationship that had produced the deformed child whose remains they had discovered. But it was the psychological evidence that painted the clearest picture of their descent into madness. Jeremiah's letters grew increasingly paranoid about outside interference, while Susanna's responses revealed a woman desperately trying to convince herself that love could transform sin into righteousness. "The world would call us monsters," she had written in one particularly revealing passage. "But the world knows nothing of pure love, of the sacred bond between souls who share not just passion but blood, memory and divine purpose. What they term abomination, heaven calls blessing." The transformation from grief-stricken siblings to incestuous lovers had not happened overnight. The correspondence revealed a gradual process of rationalization and mutual seduction that had taken nearly 2 years to complete. Each letter pushed the boundaries a little further. Each response provided validation for increasingly twisted logic, until they had created a private world where normal moral constraints no longer applied. By the time they had actually consummated their relationship, they had constructed such elaborate justifications that they viewed themselves not as sinners, but as martyrs, suffering persecution for a higher truth that common minds could not comprehend. The wedding ring remained their most tangible symbol of this delusion, a crude circle that bound them in unholy matrimony and set them on the path toward the ultimate horror that would claim their child's life. The handmade cradle sat in the cabin's darkest corner, carved from oak, with the careful attention of a father preparing for his child's arrival. Despite the crude tools available to Jeremiah Blackwood, the craftsmanship showed genuine love. Smooth surfaces that would not scratch tender skin, sides high enough to prevent falls, rockers that moved with gentle rhythm when touched. Whitmore ran his fingers along the cradle's edge, noting the intricate patterns Jeremiah had carved into the headboard. Biblical scenes depicting the Nativity, though rendered with the awkward skill of an untrained hand, revealed a man who had convinced himself he was preparing for a holy birth rather than the product of genetic catastrophe. The bedding inside, sewn from scraps of cloth that Susanna had carefully pieced together, spoke of maternal preparation despite her growing dread. Tiny quilts stitched with uneven but devoted hands, swaddling clothes cut from her own worn garments, all arranged with the hopeful precision of a woman determined to provide comfort for her child, regardless of its condition. Hayes discovered additional evidence of parental preparation scattered throughout the cabin. Wooden toys carved during long winter evenings, each piece sanded smooth and painted with dyes made from local berries. A wooden rattle that produced soft sounds when shaken, designed not to startle a child whose nervous system might be fragile. Even a crude high chair, built to accommodate a child who might never develop the strength to sit upright unassisted. But it was Susanna's detailed notes about the child's short life that revealed the true tragedy of this doomed infant. Hidden in a tin box beneath the cradle, her daily observations painted a picture of devoted parents struggling to care for a child whose very existence challenged every instinct of nurture and protection. "The child lived 7 months," Whitmore read aloud from her careful script. "Born in March during the worst blizzard we have seen, as if nature itself protested its arrival. The birth was difficult beyond description, lasting 3 days of agony that I feared would claim both our lives." The medical details Susanna recorded showed surprising knowledge for an isolated mountain woman. She had obviously educated herself about childcare through whatever books her family possessed, trying to apply normal infant care to a child whose needs defied conventional understanding. "It cannot nurse properly," she wrote in April. "The mouth is malformed, the tongue too large for proper suckling. I feed it milk from a spoon, drop by precious drop, though much is lost to choking and vomiting. Its cries are constant, a sound that pierces the soul and offers no comfort to parental hearts seeking signs of contentment." The physical descriptions grew more disturbing as the months passed. The child's head had grown disproportionately large, putting strain on a neck too weak to support its weight. One eye remained sealed shut, while the other wandered without focus. Its limbs showed severe developmental abnormalities, with one arm withered and useless while the other displayed unusual strength that allowed it to inflict scratches on anyone who handled it. "Jeremiah can barely look upon it," Susanna confessed in a particularly heartbreaking entry. "He built the cradle with such hope, carved those beautiful scenes of the Christ child's birth, believing our union would produce something blessed. Instead, we have created a creature that seems to embody every curse the outside world has pronounced upon our love." Yet despite her revulsion, Susanna's notes revealed genuine attempts at maternal care. She had sewn special clothing to accommodate the child's deformities, created padded restraints to prevent it from injuring itself during violent seizures, even attempted to teach it simple responses despite its obvious mental limitations. The child's few positive moments, carefully recorded, showed glimpses of the parents they might have been under different circumstances. "Today it seemed to recognize my voice," she wrote in June. "When I sang the old hymns Mama used to sing, its cries quieted for nearly an hour. Perhaps somewhere within that tortured form lies a soul, capable of finding peace." But as summer progressed, the entries revealed parents reaching the limits of their endurance. The child's constant suffering, combined with their own isolation and growing awareness of what they had created, began to erode their ability to maintain even basic care. "We have given it a name, though Jeremiah forbids me to write it down," she recorded in August. He says naming it makes the situation more real, as if pretending it is merely a temporary trial will somehow make it disappear. "But I cannot care for a nameless thing. Even monsters deserve the dignity of identity." The final entries about the child's life grew shorter and more desperate, chronicling parents who had begun to view their offspring not as a blessing to be cherished, but as a burden too heavy for human hearts to bear. The empty root cellar told a story of gradual starvation, more eloquent than any written account. Bare shelves that should have groaned under the weight of preserved vegetables and salted meat instead held only dust and the scattered droppings of mice who had found nothing worth stealing. Whitmore descended the wooden ladder into the underground storage space, Hayes following with a lantern that cast dancing shadows on the dirt walls. The autumn harvest of 1851 should have filled this space with enough food to sustain a family through Kentucky's harsh winter months. Instead, they found evidence of preparations that had never been completed, plans that had been abandoned as the Blackwood family's situation grew increasingly desperate. A few shriveled potatoes remained in one corner, their eyes sprouted into ghostly white tendrils reaching toward light that never came. Mason jars sat empty on crude shelves, their metal lids rusted from moisture that spoke of poor sealing and failed preservation attempts. Even the salt barrel, essential for curing meat, contained only a thin layer of mineral residue at its bottom. They tried to prepare, Hayes observed, holding his lantern near scratches on the cellar wall that appeared to be some kind of inventory system. "Look here, hash marks counting something, maybe days or portions." The hash marks, carved into the soft earth with a knife blade, painted a picture of people desperately trying to ration resources that had already run dangerously low. Groups of 5 marks, crossed by diagonal lines in the traditional counting method, filled nearly 2 feet of wall space. Someone had been tracking their dwindling supplies with the precision of people who understood that survival depended on careful measurement. Above ground, the cabin's main room provided additional evidence of the winter that had driven the Blackwood family beyond the boundaries of human decency. Furniture showed clear signs of having been burned for warmth, chair legs sawed off and used as kindling, table surfaces scarred by hatchet marks where desperate hands had harvested every available piece of wood. The fireplace, cold for months, contained ashes mixed with bone fragments that suggested the family had been reduced to burning whatever they could find. Leather shoes had been cut into strips and used as fuel, their metal eyelets scattered among the cold ashes, like tiny witnesses to desperation. Susanna's diary entries from the winter months revealed the psychological impact of their deteriorating situation. "The snow has not stopped falling for 6 days," she wrote in December 1851. "Jeremiah cannot reach the creek for water. We melt snow in pots over fires fed by furniture that once belonged to my grandmother. Each piece we burn feels like destroying another connection to the civilized world. The isolation that had once seemed like divine protection now became a death trap. Neighbors who might have offered assistance during difficult times had been driven away by the family's secretive behavior and rumors of unnatural practices. The very separation that had enabled their forbidden relationship now prevented them from seeking help when survival demanded it. The child grows weaker each day," Susanna recorded in January. "It cannot digest the thin gruel that has become our only food. Its cries have grown softer, whether from lack of strength or some merciful numbness I dare not guess. Sometimes I catch Jeremiah staring at it with an expression I cannot name, something between pity and calculation that chills my blood." The progression from hunger to starvation emerged clearly in her daily entries. Initial attempts to maintain normal meals gave way to single daily portions, then to eating every other day, finally to consuming whatever could be found regardless of its suitability for human consumption. "We have eaten the leather from our shoes," she wrote in February, "boiled into a bitter soup that burns the throat and provides little nourishment." Jeremiah speaks of hunting, but the game has moved to lower ground where the snow is not so deep. "We are trapped here like animals in a den, watching our supplies disappear while winter shows no signs of ending." The child's deteriorating condition added another layer of desperation to their circumstances. Unable to properly nourish a baby whose genetic abnormalities already made feeding difficult, they watched their offspring slowly starve while they themselves faced the same fate. "It weighs less each day," Susanna recorded in what appeared to be her final winter entry. "Its skin hangs loose on bones that seem too fragile to support even its reduced weight, yet still it clings to life with the determination of something that refuses to release its hold on existence, no matter how tormented that existence has become." The final evidence of their winter desperation lay in crude snares found near the cabin, devices designed to catch rabbits or squirrels that apparently had produced no results. Even their attempts at hunting had failed, leaving them completely dependent on resources that had been exhausted months before spring's arrival. The axe lay beneath the cabin's floorboards, wrapped in blood-stained cloth like some unholy relic, hidden from divine sight. Jeremiah had secreted it there after the deed, as if concealing the weapon might somehow undo what could never be undone. The wooden handle bore the wear marks of honest labor, chopping firewood, clearing brush, building the very cabin that had become their prison. But dark stains on the iron head spoke of its final, terrible purpose. Whitmore lifted the axe with trembling hands, noting its weight and balance. This was not a tool chosen for its efficiency in killing, but rather the only implement available when desperation finally overcame every human instinct. The blade showed chips and nicks from years of legitimate use, making its transformation into an instrument of infanticide all the more horrifying. Hayes discovered the final pages of Jeremiah's own journal hidden in a cavity behind the fireplace stones. His handwriting, always less refined than his sister's, had deteriorated into barely legible scratches by the time he recorded the events of that ultimate night. March 15, 1852, the entry began. Susanna sleeps fitfully beside the child, both of them growing thinner each day. The snow has finally stopped, but spring feels as distant as salvation. We have eaten everything: leather, tree bark, even the paste we used to chink the walls between logs. The child's cries have grown weaker, but they continue still, a constant reminder of our sin made flesh. The progression of Jeremiah's thoughts, recorded over several days, showed a man wrestling with a decision that violated every natural law. Religious justifications mixed with practical considerations in a mental framework completely severed from moral reality. Susanna speaks of ending its suffering. He continued in an entry dated 2 days later. She claims it would be mercy to release the creature from its tormented existence. Sometimes I catch her holding the pillow near its face, then pulling back as if burned by her own thoughts. We are all three, dying slowly. Perhaps swift action would spare us all prolonged agony. The transformation from mercy-killing to something far more sinister emerged in the journal's final pages. Starvation had driven both parents beyond the boundaries of civilized thought, into territory where even the most fundamental taboos could be rationalized through twisted logic. "We will starve before the week ends," Jeremiah wrote with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an inevitable conclusion. "The child cannot survive much longer in any case. Its suffering serves no purpose except to torment us all. Perhaps God has provided this trial not as punishment, but as salvation. Perhaps he offers sustenance to those brave enough to accept his terrible gifts." The religious delusions that had justified their incestuous relationship now provided framework for an even more horrific transgression. In their isolated madness, they had convinced themselves that consuming their own child represented divine providence rather than ultimate evil. The night itself was recorded in passages so disturbing that both lawmen struggled to read them completely. Jeremiah described the conversation between himself and Susanna, the gradual acceptance of what they were contemplating, the moment when starvation overcame every parental instinct. "Susanna held the child while I raised the axe," he wrote with clinical detachment. "It looked at me with those mismatched eyes, and for a moment I saw something that might have been recognition. Then I brought the blade down swift and sure, the way I had killed countless chickens over the years. The creature's suffering ended instantly, but the journal's most disturbing revelation came in its final paragraph, where Jeremiah recorded the aftermath with the calm efficiency of someone describing routine farm work. "We wrapped the body in clean cloth and spoke words over it, thanking God for his provision in our darkest hour. Susanna prepared it with the same care she once used for our Sunday meals. The meat sustained us for nearly a week, long enough for the snow to melt and the creeks to run clear again. By then we had strength enough to plant vegetables for the coming season." The practical details of their cannibalism, recorded without apparent shame or horror, revealed minds completely disconnected from human decency. They had not only killed their own child, but consumed it with the deliberate planning of people who viewed infanticide as a solution to practical problems, rather than the ultimate moral transgression. The axe itself, stained with innocent blood and hidden like evidence of ordinary crime, remained the most tangible proof of how far isolation and desperation could drive human beings beyond the boundaries of species loyalty into territory that challenged every assumption about parental love and basic humanity. The blood-stained floorboards told their own story of attempts to conceal evidence that could never truly be hidden. Dark stains had soaked deep into the wood grain, creating irregular patterns that spoke of desperate scrubbing with whatever cleaning materials the isolated family possessed. Yet despite their efforts, the marks remained visible to trained eyes, permanent testimony to acts that challenged every assumption about human nature. Whitmore knelt beside the most heavily stained area near the cabin's center, noting how the discoloration spread outward from a central point like some macabre flower blooming in wood. The pattern suggested that whatever had happened here had been deliberate rather than accidental, planned rather than impulsive. "They tried to clean it," Hayes observed, pointing to scratch marks in the wood where something abrasive had been used to scrub away evidence. "Used sand, maybe ashes from the fireplace. Wore the wood smooth, trying to erase what they'd done. But it was the psychological evidence scattered throughout the cabin that painted the clearest picture of minds attempting to cope with unthinkable guilt." Susanna's diary entries from the weeks following their crime revealed a woman desperately trying to convince herself that necessity had justified horror. The Lord provided manna to the Israelites in their wilderness wandering. She wrote in handwriting that grew increasingly erratic. He sent ravens to feed Elijah during famine. Perhaps he also provides for his chosen ones through means that common understanding cannot accept. We have survived when death seemed certain. Surely this is proof of divine favor rather than evidence of sin. The religious justifications grew more elaborate and desperate as the days passed. Both parents had thrown themselves into scriptural study with the fervor of people seeking salvation through interpretation rather than repentance. Their Bible, already marked with twisted readings from previous generations, now bore additional annotations that would have horrified any legitimate theologian. Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac at God's command. Jeremiah had written in the margins beside Genesis, "We were commanded by necessity itself, which is surely God's voice in times of extremity. The child's suffering is ended, our lives preserved. Perhaps this was always the divine plan." Yet beneath these desperate rationalizations, evidence emerged of profound psychological damage that no amount of religious delusion could entirely suppress. Susanna's sleep patterns, documented in her obsessive diary keeping, revealed a woman tormented by nightmares that grew worse each night. "I wake to the sound of crying," she recorded 3 weeks after the deed. "But when I look to the cradle, it stands empty as it has since that terrible night. The sound comes from somewhere deeper than sleep, some part of my soul that refuses to accept what we have done." Jeremiah claims he hears nothing, but I see him start at shadows and flinch when wind rattles the shutters. The couple's relationship, already twisted by incest and isolation, began to deteriorate under the weight of shared guilt. Their mutual dependency, once expressed through romantic delusion, transformed into something darker, two accomplices bound together by a secret too horrible to confess, yet too heavy to bear alone. "Jeremiah looks at me differently now," Susanna wrote in an entry dated April 1852. "Not with the loving devotion that sustained us through our early trials, but with something that might be fear or disgust. Perhaps he sees in my face a reflection of his own corruption. Perhaps we have become mirrors for each other, showing truths too terrible to acknowledge." The physical evidence of their mental deterioration manifested in increasingly erratic behavior patterns. Furniture had been rearranged obsessively, as if changing the cabin's layout might somehow alter the memories associated with specific locations. The cradle had been moved repeatedly, finally ending up in the corner where investigators found it, positioned so that it faced away from the main living area. But perhaps most disturbing were the attempts to recreate normal family life, despite the absence of the child whose murder had enabled their survival. Place settings for 3 people remained arranged on their crude table, with a small wooden bowl positioned where an infant might sit. Toys continued to be arranged as if awaiting small hands that would never again disturb their placement. "We speak of planting a larger garden this spring," Susanna recorded in what appeared to be one of her final entries. Jeremiah talks of building additions to the cabin, rooms for the children we might have in years to come. But his words ring hollow, and I suspect my own sound equally false. We are trying to convince ourselves that life can continue normally after what we have done, but normal life requires souls we no longer possess. The blood-stained floorboards remained their most honest testimony, physical evidence that refused to disappear, no matter how desperately they scrubbed or how elaborately they justified their actions. The sheriff's badge caught the last rays of autumn sunlight as Whitmore emerged from the cabin, his face bearing the weight of discoveries that would haunt him for the remainder of his days. Behind him, Hayes carried evidence bags containing items that no civilized court had ever been asked to examine. The crude axe, the blood-stained clothing, the journal entries that documented humanity's descent into territory beyond moral comprehension. But the most significant discovery lay not in physical evidence, but in the bodies they found as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the hollow. Susanna Blackwood hung from a rope fashioned from torn bedsheets, suspended from the cabin's main support beam like a broken doll abandoned by a child who had grown tired of playing house. Her face, mercifully turned away from the investigators, bore the peaceful expression of someone who had finally found release from torments that living conscience could no longer endure. A brief note, pinned to her dress with a safety pin, provided her final testimony in handwriting that remained steady despite the circumstances of its composition. "I cannot bear the weight of what we have done," the note read. "Each morning I wake hoping the previous months were nightmare rather than memory. But the empty cradle speaks truth that my heart cannot deny. May God forgive us both, though I no longer believe forgiveness possible for souls as corrupted as ours have become." Jeremiah, they found 3 days later, discovered by Hayes during a systematic search of the surrounding forest. He had made it nearly 2 miles from the cabin before whatever remained of his sanity had finally collapsed entirely. His body lay beside a creek, partially submerged in water that had frozen and thawed repeatedly, preserving him in death's cold embrace. The circumstances of his discovery suggested a man who had run from his own conscience until physical exhaustion made further flight impossible. His clothes were torn from passage through thick underbrush, his hands bloody from clawing at obstacles that blocked his desperate escape. Yet there were no signs of violence beyond what he had inflicted upon himself in his final flight from reason. "Looks like he just laid down and died," Hayes observed with the clinical detachment that both men had developed as protection against the horrors they had witnessed. "Maybe from exposure, maybe from something deeper that doctors can't diagnose." Jeremiah's final journal entry, found clutched in his frozen fingers, provided insight into the mental state that had driven him into the wilderness to die alone like a wounded animal, seeking solitude for its final moments. "Susanna has chosen her path," he had written in letters so shaky they were barely legible. "I cannot follow her into whatever peace death might offer, but neither can I remain in that place where innocents died by our own hands. The forest calls to what remains of my soul. Perhaps among the trees I can find forgiveness that human society will never grant." The confrontation with ultimate evidence of the Blackwood family's crimes tested every assumption Whitmore held about human nature and divine justice. Standing in that cursed hollow, surrounded by physical proof of acts that challenged the very foundations of civilization, he struggled to comprehend how people could descend so far into moral darkness while still maintaining enough humanity to feel guilt for their actions. "What do we do now?" Hayes asked, his young voice carrying the bewilderment of someone whose faith in human decency had been permanently shattered. "How do we explain this to folks back in town? How do we write reports about things that shouldn't be possible?" Whitmore looked back at the cabin that had sheltered 3 generations of moral decay, its log walls now standing as testimony to what isolation and desperation could accomplish when combined with religious delusion and genetic catastrophe. The building seemed somehow smaller now that its secrets had been exposed, diminished by truth in ways that mystery had never managed. "We tell the truth," he replied, though his own voice carried doubt about society's ability to process such revelations. "We document what we found, present evidence to the proper authorities, and let justice take whatever course it can. This story needs to be recorded, if only to serve as warning about what happens when people cut themselves off completely from human fellowship and moral guidance." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hollow as both men began the grim task of documenting crime scenes that would challenge legal precedent and moral understanding. They worked in silence, each lost in thoughts about the thin line separating civilization from savagery, about the fragility of social bonds that kept humanity from descending into the moral abyss that had claimed the Blackwood family. The badge on Whitmore's chest, symbol of law and order in a world that sometimes produced chaos beyond legal remedy, caught the fading light like a beacon of hope in gathering darkness. The courthouse in Frankfurt had never witnessed testimony that challenged every assumption about the bounds of human depravity. Judge Matthias Crawford, a man who had presided over murder trials, land disputes and crimes of passion for 23 years, found himself confronting evidence that existing legal frameworks seemed inadequate to address. The court transcripts, meticulously recorded by a stenographer whose hands trembled as he documented each horrific detail, would eventually be sealed and hidden away in courthouse archives where they would remain undisturbed for decades. The testimony proved too disturbing for public consumption, too challenging to contemporary understanding of parental responsibility and human nature. This court, Judge Crawford announced to the packed courtroom, faces an unprecedented legal challenge. We are asked to determine appropriate punishment for crimes that have no clear precedent in American jurisprudence. The defendants are already deceased, having chosen their own punishment through suicide and exposure. Yet the nature of their acts demands legal recognition and formal judgment. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Harwick, struggled to find adequate charges for crimes that seemed to transcend normal criminal categories. Infanticide alone seemed insufficient to encompass the full scope of the Blackwood family's transgressions. Incest, while clearly documented, was overshadowed by the more horrific charge of cannibalism. Your Honor, Harwick addressed the court with visible difficulty, we are dealing with acts that challenge the very foundations of civilized society. The evidence shows deliberate planning, religious justification, and consumption of human flesh in violation of every law, both divine and human. The defense, appointed by the court despite the defendants' deaths, faced the impossible task of finding mitigating circumstances for actions that seemed to admit no rational explanation. Attorney Samuel Morrison, a respected member of the Kentucky Bar, found himself arguing points of law that he privately believed undermined the moral foundations of society itself. The isolation these people endured, Morrison argued with obvious reluctance, combined with genetic abnormalities resulting from generational inbreeding, created circumstances that may have diminished their capacity for rational judgment. We ask the court to consider that extreme privation can drive human beings to acts they would never contemplate under normal circumstances. The expert testimony proved even more disturbing than the physical evidence. Dr. Elias Thornton, one of Kentucky's few trained physicians with knowledge of mental ailments, attempted to explain the psychological factors that might drive parents to consume their own children. Prolonged isolation creates its own form of madness, Dr. Thornton testified. When combined with genetic damage from inbreeding and the extreme stress of starvation, the human mind can construct justifications for acts that would normally trigger the strongest taboos. These people may have been legally insane at the time of their crimes, but it was the testimony of Father Michael O'Brien, brought in to address the religious justifications found in the Blackwood family writings, that provided the most chilling insights into their mental state. Their biblical interpretations represent a complete perversion of Christian doctrine, Father O'Brien testified with obvious distress. They selected passages that could be twisted to support their actions while ignoring the overwhelming scriptural evidence against such behavior. This suggests deliberate rationalization rather than genuine religious conviction. The jury, composed of 12 men drawn from Kentucky's farming communities, struggled visibly with evidence that challenged their fundamental assumptions about human nature. Several jurors requested to be excused during the most graphic testimony, claiming that knowledge of such acts would permanently damage their ability to trust in human decency. I have witnessed war, testified former Union Colonel James Mitchell, who served as jury foreman. I have seen men kill each other over political differences and territorial disputes, but what we have heard described in this courtroom represents something beyond warfare, beyond any conflict between human beings that I can comprehend. The verdict, delivered after 3 days of deliberation, established legal precedents that would influence American jurisprudence for generations. Though the defendants were dead, the court ruled that their crimes represented such fundamental violations of human law that formal condemnation was necessary to maintain social order. The acts committed by Jeremiah and Susanna Blackwood, Judge Crawford announced in his final ruling, represent a descent into moral territory so profound that they challenge our understanding of what it means to be human. While death has already claimed these individuals, this court finds them guilty of infanticide, incest, cannibalism, and crimes against the natural order that governs civilized society. The sentence, though purely symbolic given the defendants' deaths, included provisions for the destruction of all physical evidence and the sealing of court records to prevent the case from becoming public spectacle. Yet even these precautions could not prevent the story from spreading through whispered conversations and fearful rumors that would haunt Kentucky's mountain communities for generations to come. The newspaper headlines spread across America like wildfire in autumn grass, each publication struggling to find words adequate to describe events that challenged every assumption about human nature. Kentucky family commits ultimate sin, proclaimed the Louisville Herald. Parents devour their own child. declared the Cincinnati Enquirer, in letters large enough to be read from across the street. The Associated Press wire service carried the story to major cities throughout the nation, though many editors found themselves censoring the most disturbing details for fear of corrupting public morality. The New York Tribune ran a heavily edited version under the headline, "Mountain Family Tragedy Shocks Nation," while the Charleston Mercury refused to print the story at all, claiming it was too disturbing for Christian readers. Public reaction varied wildly across different regions and social classes. Urban newspapers treated the case as evidence of the moral dangers inherent in frontier isolation, using the Blackwood tragedy to support arguments for westward expansion of civilized institutions. Rural publications, conversely, viewed the story as an attack on mountain communities and independent living. This terrible tragedy illustrates the dangers of complete separation from Christian fellowship and moral guidance, editorialized the Boston Globe. When families isolate themselves entirely from civilized society, they risk descending into barbarism that would shame the most primitive tribes. This case argues strongly for the establishment of schools, churches, and government institutions in even the most remote areas of our expanding nation. The medical community found itself grappling with questions about heredity and mental capacity that challenged contemporary understanding of human psychology. Dr. Benjamin Rush, one of America's leading alienists, published a lengthy analysis in the American Journal of Medical Sciences that attempted to explain the Blackwood family's descent into madness through scientific rather than moral frameworks. The evidence suggests that prolonged inbreeding, combined with complete social isolation, created conditions that fundamentally altered normal human responses, Dr. Rush wrote. While this does not excuse their actions, it may explain how rational beings could convince themselves that infanticide and cannibalism represented acceptable solutions to practical problems. Religious leaders across denominational lines struggled to address congregational questions about how such events could occur within a Christian nation. Sermons delivered throughout the fall of 1852 grappled with theological questions about human nature, divine providence, and the relationship between faith and civilization. Father Patrick McKenna of St. Mary's Cathedral in Baltimore delivered what became one of the most widely reprinted responses to the Blackwood case. This tragedy reminds us that faith divorced from fellowship, scripture interpreted without guidance, and isolation embraced too completely can lead even well-intentioned souls into territory that challenges divine law itself. True Christianity requires community, accountability, and submission to established moral authority. But perhaps the most significant impact occurred within Kentucky's law enforcement community, where Sheriff Whitmore found himself reluctantly elevated to national prominence as the man who had uncovered America's most disturbing crime. Requests for interviews arrived from newspapers across the country, though Whitmore declined most opportunities to discuss cases that had already cost him too much sleep. "People want to understand how such things happen," Whitmore confided to Deputy Hayes during one of their regular discussions about the case's lingering effects. "They think if they can explain it, they can prevent it from happening again, but some human behaviors don't have explanations that make sense to decent folks." The legal precedents established by the Blackwood trial influenced legislation in several states, leading to new laws governing marriage between relatives and mandatory reporting requirements for suspected child abuse. Kentucky itself passed the Blackwood Act in 1853, requiring county officials to conduct periodic welfare checks on families living in extreme isolation. Medical schools began incorporating the case into their curricula as an example of how genetic and environmental factors could combine to produce catastrophic results. The University of Kentucky Medical College established a special archive dedicated to documenting similar cases, though none would prove as extreme as the Blackwood tragedy. Yet despite official efforts to address the case through legal and medical frameworks, its most lasting impact occurred in the realm of folklore and collective memory. Stories about the cursed hollow where unspeakable acts had been committed spread through oral tradition, growing more elaborate and terrifying with each retelling. Local children were warned away from the abandoned Blackwood property through cautionary tales that transformed historical fact into supernatural legend. Parents used the story to emphasize the importance of maintaining connections with church and community, turning tragedy into moral instruction designed to prevent similar isolations. The cabin itself, left empty after the investigation concluded, became a destination for curious visitors and thrill-seekers who wanted to see where such horrors had occurred. Local authorities eventually burned the structure in 1854, claiming it posed a public safety hazard, though most observers understood the real motivation was to eliminate a landmark that attracted unwanted attention to their community. The official correspondence between Kentucky's governor and federal authorities revealed a coordinated effort to minimize the Blackwood case's impact on the state's reputation and national standing. Governor Lazarus Powell, already dealing with mounting tensions between North and South, viewed the scandal as an unwelcome distraction that portrayed Kentucky's mountain communities in the worst possible light. This unfortunate incident, Governor Powell wrote to Secretary of the Interior Alexander Stewart in November 1852, while undeniably tragic, represents an isolated case of moral degeneracy that should not be permitted to reflect poorly upon the character of Kentucky's citizens as a whole. I respectfully request federal cooperation in limiting further publicity that might damage our state's reputation during these already difficult times. The government's response involved systematic suppression of documents and evidence that might fuel continued public interest in the case. Court records were sealed indefinitely, physical evidence was destroyed, and participating officials were strongly encouraged to avoid discussing the matter with journalists or curiosity seekers. Sheriff Whitmore found himself pressured by both state and federal authorities to cease granting interviews about the investigation. I was told in no uncertain terms that continued discussion of the case would be viewed as detrimental to Kentucky's interests, he later confided to his personal diary. They want this story to disappear entirely, as if pretending it never happened might somehow undo the damage to our collective conscience. The newspaper coverage that had initially spread the story across America gradually diminished under pressure from government officials and prominent citizens who viewed continued attention as harmful to national morale. Editors received visits from federal marshals carrying suggestions that reporting on such disturbing cases might be considered unpatriotic during times of national crisis. Local families with any connection to the Blackwood name began desperate attempts to distance themselves from the scandal. Marriage records were altered, family Bibles were rewritten, and genealogical information was deliberately falsified to eliminate any suggestion of relationship to the notorious family. The most systematic cover-up efforts focused on the hollow itself, where the Blackwood cabin had stood as physical testimony to the horrors that isolation could produce. County officials declared the area unsafe for habitation and prohibited access to anyone except authorized personnel conducting environmental assessments. "We cannot allow this place to become a shrine to depravity," declared County Commissioner Harrison Blake in confidential correspondence discovered decades later. "Every tourist who visits, every curiosity seeker who comes to see where such acts occurred, serves to keep alive memories that decent society should forget entirely." The destruction of the cabin in 1854 represented the culmination of these suppression efforts. Official records claimed the burning was necessary due to structural damage and fire hazard, but private correspondence revealed the true motivation, eliminating physical evidence that might attract continued attention to Kentucky's darkest secret. Even the cemetery where previous generations of Blackwoods had been buried became a target for historical revision. Headstones were removed or altered, burial records were lost or destroyed, and the entire family history was systematically erased from official documentation. Religious leaders cooperated willingly in these efforts, viewing the case as a stain on Christian civilization that required active forgetting rather than continued examination. Church records were purged of references to the Blackwood family, baptismal certificates were destroyed, and ministers were instructed to avoid using the case as sermon material. The medical community, despite initial scientific interest in the case's implications for understanding heredity and mental illness, gradually ceased publishing analyses or references to the Blackwood tragedy. Research papers were withdrawn from circulation, and medical schools removed the case from their curricula, under pressure from administrators who feared association with such disturbing material. Dr. Benjamin Rush, whose initial analysis had garnered significant attention, later published a retraction, claiming his earlier conclusions had been based on incomplete evidence.
Further reflection has convinced me that this case represents such an extreme aberration from normal human behavior that it offers no useful insights for medical science. He wrote in 1854, "Continued study of such degeneracy serves no beneficial purpose for advancing human knowledge. The transformation of historical fact into deliberate amnesia occurred gradually but systematically across all levels of society. What had begun as legitimate concerns about protecting Kentucky's reputation evolved into a comprehensive effort to erase the Blackwood case from collective memory entirely. Yet despite these official efforts, the story proved impossible to suppress completely. Whispered accounts continued to circulate through Appalachian communities, and oral traditions preserved details that official documentation had eliminated. The very attempts to hide the truth seemed to enhance its power, transforming historical fact into forbidden knowledge that carried additional weight, precisely because authorities wanted it forgotten. The government correspondence that documented these suppression efforts would remain hidden in federal archives for over a century, serving as evidence of how thoroughly American institutions sought to deny one of their nation's most disturbing crimes. The genealogy records scattered across courthouse basements and church archives told a story of lasting damage that extended far beyond the immediate Blackwood family. Marriage certificates from the 1850s through 1890s revealed unusual patterns of documentation, with many mountain families suddenly providing extensive bloodline verification where none had been required previously. County clerks reported increased requests for family history research from people bearing surnames that bore even remote similarity to Blackwood. The Morrison, Woodhouse, and Blackwell families all experienced sudden scrutiny from potential marriage partners who wanted absolute assurance that no genetic connection existed to Kentucky's most notorious clan. Dr. Samuel Henderson, Kentucky's first official genealogist appointed in 1875, discovered disturbing patterns while conducting the state's initial comprehensive family registry. His private notes, found decades later in state archives, revealed bloodlines that had been deliberately obscured or falsified in the aftermath of the Blackwood scandal. The impact of this single case on marriage patterns throughout Appalachian Kentucky cannot be overstated, Dr. Henderson wrote in confidential correspondence to the state medical board. Families that had practiced cousin marriage for generations suddenly began seeking spouses from distant counties, often traveling hundreds of miles to find partners with absolutely no shared ancestry. The psychological impact on law enforcement officials who had been involved in the investigation proved equally lasting. Sheriff Whitmore never fully recovered from his exposure to the case, developing what his personal physician described as nervous exhaustion that plagued him for the remainder of his career. Deputy Hayes left law enforcement entirely within 2 years of the investigation, claiming that the Blackwood case had destroyed his faith in human decency. He moved to California during the gold rush, apparently seeking distance from memories that continued to disturb his sleep and affect his ability to trust in basic human goodness. "I cannot look at young families without wondering what circumstances might drive them to unspeakable acts," Hayes wrote in a letter to his former supervisor. "The Blackwood case taught me that every parent is capable of becoming a monster if conditions align in terrible ways. This knowledge has made normal human relationships impossible for me." The case's influence on American sociology and early psychology proved more constructive, though no less disturbing. The emerging field of mental health treatment found in the Blackwood tragedy a compelling case study for understanding how isolation and genetic factors could combine to produce catastrophic behavioral changes. Dr. Isaac Curlin, superintendent of the Pennsylvania Training School for Feeble-Minded Children, incorporated the case into his groundbreaking research on hereditary mental deficiency. His 1877 publication, Genetic Influences on Moral Development, used the Blackwood family as primary evidence for arguments supporting institutional care for people with developmental disabilities. The Blackwood case demonstrates conclusively that certain genetic combinations, when isolated from corrective social influences, inevitably produce moral and intellectual degeneracy, Dr. Curlin wrote. This tragic family's history argues strongly for medical intervention in marriage decisions and reproductive choices among populations showing signs of hereditary weakness. Educational institutions throughout Appalachian regions experienced dramatic changes in curriculum and social policies designed to prevent similar isolations from developing. Schools that had previously served individual families or small communities were consolidated into larger institutions that promoted broader social contact and cultural exchange. The Kentucky Education Act of 1860 specifically mandated that no family could educate children in complete isolation without regular inspection by certified teachers who could identify signs of unnatural family relationships or moral degradation.
While the legislation never explicitly mentioned the Blackwood case, its provisions clearly reflected lessons learned from that tragedy. Religious denominations implemented similar preventive measures, with the Baptist and Methodist churches requiring regular home visits to families living in remote areas. Ministers were trained to recognize warning signs of inappropriate family relationships and empowered to report concerns to civil authorities. The Cumberland Presbyterian Church went furthest in its response, establishing mandatory counseling programs for families requesting permission to marry within prohibited degrees of relationship. These programs, though controversial among advocates for religious freedom, were specifically designed to prevent the kind of theological rationalization that had enabled the Blackwood family's descent into depravity. Perhaps most significantly, the case influenced the development of America's first systematic approach to child welfare protection. Social workers began conducting regular assessments of children living in isolated circumstances, and legal frameworks were established for removing children from families showing signs of dangerous dysfunction. The Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, established in New York in 1874, explicitly cited the Blackwood case as evidence for the need for institutional intervention in family relationships that might threaten child safety. Their founding documents referenced Kentucky's tragedy as proof that parental authority must be balanced against societal responsibility for protecting vulnerable innocents. These institutional changes, while motivated by genuine desire to prevent similar tragedies, also reflected broader cultural anxieties about frontier independence and the proper balance between individual freedom and social control in an expanding nation. The yellowed manuscript pages discovered in the Kentucky Historical Society archives bore the title, The Ballad of Blackwood Hollow, written in the careful script of someone who understood that some stories could only be preserved through song. The folk ballad, composed by an anonymous mountain musician sometime in the 1870s, revealed how the horrific truth had been transformed into cautionary tale through the alchemy of oral tradition. Down in the hollow where the sun don't shine, lived a family cursed by their bloodline. Brother took sister as his lawful wife, and brought into this world a cursed life. The verses that followed, 18 stanzas in total, chronicled the entire Blackwood tragedy, with the stark honesty that only folk tradition could manage. Unlike newspaper accounts that had been sanitized for public consumption, or government records that had been deliberately suppressed, the ballad preserved every disturbing detail through melody that mountain people could remember and pass along. The song's popularity throughout Appalachian communities demonstrated how effectively music could preserve historical memory, even when official institutions sought to erase it. Versions of the ballad were collected by folklorists in Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and North Carolina, each variant adding regional details while maintaining the core narrative of isolation, inbreeding, and ultimate horror. The baby came twisted, the baby came wrong, cried day and night with a pitiful song. When winter came hard and the cupboard was bare, they did what no parents should ever dare. The ballad's influence extended far beyond mere entertainment, serving as a moral instruction that taught mountain communities about the dangers of excessive isolation. Parents used the song to warn children about straying too far from civilized company, while young couples received it as cautionary guidance about proper mate selection. Sarah McClellan, a folk song collector who traveled through Kentucky in the 1890s, documented dozens of variations in her journal, Songs of the Southern Mountains. Her notes revealed how different communities had adapted the basic narrative to reflect their own particular concerns and values. In some versions, McClellan wrote, the emphasis falls on religious themes, with the family's misinterpretation of scripture serving as the primary moral lesson. Other variants focus on the dangers of geographical isolation, using the Blackwood story to argue for better roads and communication with outside communities. The ballad's transformation into children's folklore proved particularly significant for understanding how American culture processed traumatic historical events. Playground versions emerged that reduced the complex tragedy to simple rhyming games, allowing young minds to engage with disturbing material in psychologically manageable forms. Blackwood, down in the dell, did what the devil would never tell. If you go walking where they once did dwell, you'll hear their baby crying still.
These children's versions, while significantly sanitized, preserved essential elements of the story, while providing moral framework that helped young people understand boundaries between acceptable and forbidden behavior. Child psychologists studying the phenomenon noted how effectively the ballad format allowed difficult lessons to be transmitted across generations. The song's influence on American literature proved equally significant, with elements of the Blackwood story appearing in works by authors who had absorbed the tale through folk tradition rather than historical documentation. Early Gothic novelists drew inspiration from ballad imagery, while regional writers incorporated themes of isolation and moral decay that clearly echoed the Kentucky tragedy. Nathaniel Hawthorne's later stories showed clear influence from the Blackwood ballad tradition, particularly in their exploration of how geographical isolation could enable moral corruption. His private notebooks contained references to the Kentucky Horror and speculation about how frontier conditions might affect human character development. Even Mark Twain, whose work typically avoided such dark themes, incorporated elements that seemed derived from Blackwood folklore. His descriptions of isolated river families in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn reflected awareness of how separation from civilized society could produce disturbing behavioral patterns. The ballad's preservation in multiple versions across several states demonstrated the power of oral tradition to maintain historical memory despite official efforts at suppression. While government records had been sealed and newspaper coverage had been discouraged, mountain musicians ensured that the Blackwood story continued to circulate through communities that understood its important lessons. Professional musicians eventually discovered the ballad and introduced it to urban audiences, though typically in heavily edited versions that eliminated the most disturbing details. The Carter family recorded a sanitized variant in 1928, while Woody Guthrie included references to Blackwood Hollow in several of his Depression-era compositions. Yet despite these mainstream adaptations, the complete ballad survived primarily in mountain communities where its original function as moral instruction remained relevant to people who still lived in conditions similar to those that had enabled the original tragedy. The manuscript's preservation in the Historical Society archives represented recognition that folk songs could serve as legitimate historical documents, preserving cultural memory that official sources had deliberately obscured. The archaeological excavation of the Blackwood Hollow in 1952, exactly 1 century after the original tragedy, revealed physical evidence that confirmed even the most disturbing elements of the historical record. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, leading a University of Kentucky team investigating 19th-century settlement patterns, had no knowledge of the site's dark history when she selected it for academic study. "We chose this location because early surveys indicated a substantial family homestead that had been mysteriously abandoned," Dr. Thornfield recorded in her expedition journal. The site promised to provide excellent data about pioneer living conditions and domestic arrangements in isolated mountain communities. The first discoveries seemed routine for frontier archaeology. Foundation stones marked the outline of a substantial cabin, while scattered pottery fragments and metal implements told typical stories of subsistence farming and domestic production. But as the excavation progressed, the team uncovered evidence that challenged their understanding of normal pioneer life. The soil analysis conducted by Dr. James Morrison, the expedition's forensic specialist, revealed unusual chemical compositions that suggested the presence of human remains in areas where no formal burial ground should have existed. Carbon dating of bone fragments found near the cabin's foundation confirmed their 19th century origin, but also revealed disturbing patterns of cut marks and breakage. These bones show clear evidence of deliberate human modification, Dr. Morrison reported to the Kentucky Historical Commission. The cut marks are consistent with butchering practices, but applied to human rather than animal remains. The age of the bones matches the period when this site was occupied, suggesting contemporary rather than prehistoric origin. The most significant discovery occurred when graduate student Thomas Bradley uncovered a metal box buried beneath what had been the cabin's main room floor. The container, remarkably well preserved despite a century of burial, contained documents that revealed the site's true identity and confirmed the most horrific elements of folklore that many historians had dismissed as exaggerated legend. Inside the box, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from moisture and decay, the team found Jeremiah Blackwood's final journal entries, additional pages from Susanna's diary, and what appeared to be a detailed confession written shortly before their deaths. These documents provided first-hand accounts that verified the accuracy of ballad traditions and oral histories that academic historians had previously discounted. What we have discovered, Dr. Thornfield wrote in her preliminary report, appears to confirm one of Kentucky's most disturbing historical legends. The physical evidence supports accounts of infanticide, cannibalism, and incestuous relationships that many scholars had assumed were folklore embellishments of more conventional frontier tragedies. The DNA analysis, conducted using newly developed forensic techniques, provided scientific confirmation of the family relationships described in historical documents.
Bone samples from 3 different individuals showed genetic markers consistent with extreme inbreeding across multiple generations, validating even the most sensational claims about the Blackwood family's reproductive practices. Dr. Patricia Newman, the expedition's genetic specialist, found the results so disturbing that she initially questioned the accuracy of her own testing procedures. The genetic evidence indicates inbreeding patterns that exceed anything documented in modern medical literature, she reported. These results suggest reproductive relationships that would be considered impossible under normal social constraints. Modern psychological analysis of the preserved writings provided new insights into the mental processes that had enabled such extreme behavior.
Dr. Robert Caldwell, a psychiatrist consulted by the archaeological team, identified clear patterns of rationalization and moral dissociation that explained how intelligent people could justify acts that violated fundamental human taboos. The documents reveal sophisticated psychological defense mechanisms, Dr. Caldwell analyzed. These individuals constructed elaborate religious and practical justifications that allowed them to maintain self-image as moral beings while committing acts that any outside observer would recognize as fundamentally evil. Their isolation enabled this self-deception by eliminating external perspective that might have challenged their rationalization. The expedition's findings sparked renewed academic interest in the case, leading to comprehensive historical research that corrected decades of suppression and denial. University libraries began acquiring copies of previously sealed court records, while historical societies published corrected accounts that acknowledged the full scope of the Blackwood tragedy. Yet the archaeological evidence also raised disturbing questions about how many similar cases might have occurred in isolated frontier communities without ever being discovered or documented. The systematic nature of the evidence suggested that the Blackwood family's crimes had been carefully planned and executed over an extended period, implying a level of social dysfunction that might have been more common than comfortable historical narratives had acknowledged. The site itself was quietly reburied after the excavation concluded, with university officials deciding that preserving it as a historical landmark would serve no beneficial educational purpose. The location was marked only by a discreet academic publication that ensured the findings remained available to serious scholars while avoiding the sensationalism that public attention might generate. The simple granite marker placed at the edge of the former Blackwood Hollow in 2002 bore no names, no dates, no explicit reference to the horrors that had occurred there 150 years earlier. The inscription, chosen after considerable debate among the Kentucky Historical Commission, read simply, "In memory of all victims of isolation and desperation, may their suffering serve as eternal warning against the dangers of abandoning human fellowship." The decision to install any memorial at all had sparked intense controversy within academic and political circles. Opponents argued that commemorating such acts might inspire copycat crimes or provide notoriety to behavior that deserved only condemnation. Supporters countered that ignoring historical tragedy served no purpose except to ensure its potential repetition. Dr. Sarah Manning, the University of Kentucky historian who championed the memorial project, argued that the Blackwood case represented something more significant than individual moral failure. This tragedy illuminates fundamental questions about human nature, social responsibility, and the conditions that enable ordinary people to cross boundaries they should never approach, she wrote in her proposal to the Historical Commission. The memorial's placement deliberately avoided the actual site of the former cabin, instead occupying a small clearing visible from the county road that wound through the hollow. This location allowed respectful acknowledgement of the tragedy, while preventing the site from becoming a destination for curiosity seekers, drawn by morbid fascination rather than historical understanding. The broader context that made the Blackwood case America's darkest secret lay not in the specific acts themselves, disturbing as they were, but in what they revealed about the fragility of civilized behavior under extreme conditions. The family's descent into moral territory that challenged basic human categories demonstrated how quickly social bonds could dissolve when external support systems disappeared entirely. The case forced uncomfortable recognition that the ethical frameworks supporting civilized society required constant maintenance through community interaction, institutional oversight, and shared moral education. Without these supports, even well-intentioned people could convince themselves that survival justified acts that would horrify them under normal circumstances. The religious dimensions of the tragedy proved particularly troubling for a nation that viewed itself as fundamentally Christian in character. The Blackwood family's ability to find scriptural justification for incest, infanticide, and cannibalism challenged assumptions about the inherent moral guidance provided by biblical faith. Their twisted theology demonstrated how religious conviction divorced from communal interpretation and institutional authority could enable rather than prevent moral catastrophe. The genetic factors that contributed to the family's dysfunction raised equally disturbing questions about heredity, personal responsibility, and the relationship between physical and moral characteristics. While modern science rejected simplistic connections between genetic abnormalities and criminal behavior, the Blackwood case illustrated how biological vulnerabilities could interact with environmental stresses to produce catastrophic results. Perhaps most significantly, the case revealed the dangerous potential of complete social isolation in a culture that increasingly celebrated individual independence and self-reliance. The Blackwood family had begun with admirable desires for religious purity and self-sufficiency that reflected core American values. Their transformation into monsters illustrated how these same values, taken to extremes without balancing social connections, could enable rather than prevent moral disaster. The century and a half of suppression, denial, and gradual acknowledgement that followed the original crime demonstrated America's ongoing struggle to process historical events that challenged national self-image. The systematic efforts to erase the Blackwood story from official records reflected broader patterns of historical amnesia that affected how the nation understood its own character and development. The case's preservation through folk tradition, while official sources remained sealed, illustrated the complex relationship between popular memory and institutional authority in American culture. The ballads and oral histories that kept the story alive served educational functions that formal historical documentation had abandoned, providing moral instruction that academic sources could not offer. The ultimate lesson of the Blackwood tragedy lay in its demonstration that human beings, regardless of their initial intentions or religious convictions, remained capable of descending to depths that challenged every assumption about civilized behavior. This recognition demanded humility about moral certainty and vigilance about the social conditions that enabled or prevented such descents. The memorial stone itself represented a mature acknowledgement that American history included events too disturbing to celebrate but too significant to ignore. By confronting rather than denying the darkest chapters of national experience, contemporary Americans could better understand both the achievements and the vulnerabilities of the civilization they had inherited. The inscription's emphasis on isolation and the abandonment of human fellowship provided the most important lesson that subsequent generations could draw from the Blackwood tragedy, that civilization was not a permanent achievement, but a fragile construction that required constant maintenance through community, compassion, and shared commitment to values that transcended individual survival.